Want to introduce to you our next speaker, Ginger Johnson. She's come down from Spokane to be with us today. And just to give her a little bit about who she is, she's a state-certified domestic violence perpetrator treatment program supervisor. She facilitates male and female perpetrator treatment programs, certified facilitator of domestic violence victims groups. She also sits on the Domestic Violence Coalition and the Domestic Violence Impact Panel Committee in Spokane. Married and a mother of two, and even though she's a regional director for ARMS, she recently just started her own business called Relationships Advantage, where she's able to help coach and counsel people when it comes to domestic violence. But had a little opportunity to talk with her, and she explained one of the reasons why she's so passionate, why she does what she does, is because she grew up in the church, and at one point in her life, she had a life experience that was life-changing. And through that, she wanted to, after getting out from that, she wanted to be able to create something or do something that would build a bridge with churches that in the regards to abuse, to be able to help churches and help people, victims of abuse. So just a warm welcome for Ginger Johnson.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here with you today and talking about this issue. I've been here, I don't remember exactly how long ago, a year ago, 6 months ago. And so this has been a conference that I've known about for quite some time. We started planning and you said I could come, and I've been excited to come back to this church. I was so thrilled by a certain pastor's blog that was shared with me. And I work in so many communities where churches are, I hate to say, the perpetrators against victims oftentimes, and it's so difficult to try to help someone who's being told they can't come back to church until they reconcile and not understanding the issue. And so to hear a pastor write what your pastor wrote, it was exciting. I shared it and shared it and shared it. And so many victims responded and said, I wish my pastor had had that heart. And so this conference is kind of that culmination of your pastor's heart and the other individuals who work in this church. So I really, I have a lot of information to share in a short period of time, so I'm kind of excited to get started. But there's question and answers at the end, so feel free to ask whatever you want. On your yellow sheet, it's not on my presentation, but the phone number's on the yellow sheet to text your question, and I'd be happy to take those toward the end. So domestic violence is the term that we use in culture, but I prefer to use the term domestic abuse because, first of all, that's what we're talking about today, but also violence we tend to think of as physical abuse, the thing that's against the law, the thing that you can see someone has a black eye and we know that's not okay. But there's a whole lot more going on, typically long before the physical abuse, and that's the emotional and psychological, and we're going to talk about that today. All right, it's changing on my screen, but not on the big screen. Well, anyway. So one of the things that we talk about when we deal with domestic abuse is that all of our attitudes and our behaviors come from a pattern of beliefs. And so when we have a belief system, that's where you can't behave in a way that is contrary to your beliefs. Now, some of us say that we believe in God, but the question is, faith is acting like it. And oftentimes we don't act like we believe in God, we actually act in fear. And so that's why building up our faith is so critical. And the same is true with domestic abuse. If you believe that someone is equal to you and valued and important, and yet you say you believe that, but you're treating them in a way that's abusive, there's a problem there. Your beliefs and your behaviors are not working together. So I've got a cute little house on here that shows this illustration. I see it. One of the things I wanted to mention, and I'll just go ahead, I wrote down a couple notes earlier today. There are many reasons why people use abusive behaviors and develop patterns of power and control, but none of them are excuses for abusive behavior. So if you are in a relationship where someone is being abusive toward you, there are a lot of reasons. Maybe they were raised that way. They think it's normal. Maybe you didn't have the dishes done. Maybe you don't look great, or you've gained 10 pounds or whatever. But none of that is an excuse for abusive behavior. One of the things that we talk about in abuse recovery ministry and services is that abuse is like, instead of thinking of it, there's my house. Instead of like child abuse, we instead of an adult abuse, we talk about it like child abuse. If your child was being abused at school and they came home and said, Mommy, somebody's been, hurting me and calling me names and treating me in a very disrespectful way, and I don't like it, I don't want to go back, right? We call that bullying, right, which is actually abuse for children. But you don't say, oh, honey, I'm sure you'll be fine, you just go back to school. And the next day they come and their clothes are torn and they've got scratches. How many days are you going to let that happen before you march right down to that school and you find out what's going on and what's going to be done about it? Do you think God cares for his children less than you care for your children? Is it okay for a child of God to be completely disrespected, mistreated, and abused in a relationship? And you think God's up in heaven going, well, you should have prayed some more. You didn't read Fireproof, evidently. You need to submit. I make jokes about Christian movies, and I'm sorry, it's not right. I can't tell you how many women come to our victim programs and talk about all the books they've read and all the movies they've seen and all the marriage counseling they've gone to. But an abusive relationship is not the same as normal marriage conflict. You cannot pray an abusive person to stop. He has free will, and he's making choices about his behavior. So there's a big difference between domestic violence, domestic abuse, and normal marriage conflict, okay? And that's really important to understand, because the women that come to, by the time they get to an abuse group where they're trying to learn how to heal from the situation, they've tried everything. It's not that they haven't prayed the right sequence of verses and prayers and talked to the right people. They've tried everything to save this relationship. And none of it's working because they can't change the other person. They can only change themselves. All right, looks like we're back up and running. Yeah, all right. So we have our beliefs down at the bottom. And then we have control, wanting to control whatever's going on, and that creates the abusive behaviors. So it's a pattern of power and control, and Peter talked about that really well this morning. So there are all different kinds of types of abuse. We understand physical abuse. Like I said earlier, it's against the law. Stalking is psychological abuse, and actually that's against the law. They're creating more and more strict rules around that because technology has made it absolutely possible to stalk just anybody. It's called parental controls. Did you ever notice that? You can figure out where your kid is in the car if they borrow the car. Well, you can use that with your wife. And that's an abusive behavior, isn't it? Spying on your family is not acceptable. So anytime those great commercials on TV talk about how you can find out where all of the phones on your plan are at any given time, I immediately cringe and think that abusive husbands are using that to find out where their wife is. So we have verbal, psychological, physical, financial, sexual, property, spiritual, and animal, or animal and spiritual as it is on there. I'm going to talk a little bit about what each one of those looks like. And we're going to explain just briefly. So physical abuse, again, it's hitting, punching, slapping, pinching, restraining, strangulation, and posturing. You don't have to actually hit somebody to be physically abusive to them because there's a threat of. They know that next time it's a strong possibility. So you don't necessarily have to hit somebody for someone to feel in physical fear. And strangulation is one of the fastest growing ways of controlling. I would say it's like 8 out of 10 of the women I work with have been strangled. And how many do you think report? Not very many women report because it is a very serious physical injury, and actually it can take days before all the effects can appear. Very serious. Verbal abuse, we recognize that. No one wants to be yelled at. No one wants to be called names, put down, sarcasm, swearing, abusive jokes, blaming, and the silent treatment. It's always one of my favorites. That's a go-to abusive behavior because you're not doing anything. So how could it be abusive? but it's a pattern of power and control. If someone refuses to have a conversation with you that you need to have in a relationship, that is a way to control them. So that is abuse. Psychological abuse, mind games, stalking, isolation, crazy making, using the children, looks and stares to generate fear. There's so many things that fall into this category. Most women define it as walking on eggshells, never knowing what is going to happen, feeling like what I did yesterday he was okay with, I did the same thing today, and he went crazy. Never knowing what each day is going to bring and what the consequences will be. Financial abuse. Some people have never, in an abusive relationship, never experienced financial abuse, and some, this is a huge way of controlling someone. This can be, my own experience was, my name wasn't on any of the bank accounts, it wasn't on the car, it wasn't on the lease. I had no person. When he left, I had nothing. I wasn't allowed to live there, I wasn't allowed to have the car, and I couldn't get any money out of the bank. So all of a sudden, I'm nothing and have no access to anything. And we see that more and more. Also, in relationships with financial abuse, one of the other things we see is it doesn't happen until there's a separation, and then she can get cut off financially. And how does a couple, if he's the working person and she's with the kids, the easiest way to control her and get her to do what you want is don't give her any money. Then she's much more willing to comply. So financial abuse becomes a huge issue in separation and divorce. Sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is the one we don't talk about because we're in church, right? All the guys that I work with in perpetrator treatment think that sexual abuse means rape, and they've never done that, so end of story. But what we find is almost every abusive relationship has a sexual abuse component because it's the most intimate and vulnerable relationship that you have, and it's very easy to control someone sexually. So any kind of put-downs, unwanted touch, badgering for sex, sexual name-calling, extreme jealousy. We also see withholding sex as a way to control someone. And sexual abuse, we hold a very high standard with the men that I work with. So we talk about how using any kind of sexual word as a cuss word is sexual abuse because it's objectifying women, and it's almost, you notice almost all bad words are sexual. So they really don't like that because a lot of those are just adjectives they use in everyday sentences. But I tell them, well, then that was sexual. So they really start paying attention to the kind of words they're using. Words are a huge way that we allow abuse in our life because we minimize, justify, and deny with our words our own behaviors. So that's one of the areas that we really deal with. Property abuse. We see a lot of this. Cell phones. And anything around the house, slamming doors. Peter mentioned punching holes in the walls, sabotaging the car, and of course, any kind of weapon. See a lot of, this will be a charge typically of malicious mischief, if they're charged with an actual crime. If they break or destroy any kind of property, that will be a malicious mischief charge, and that's against the law as well. This is one that's heartbreaking. This is, to me, one of the most powerful forms of abuse. It was the one that worked on me so well, I didn't know what was going on anymore. I remember being told that I wasn't a Christian and there was no way he could be holy enough to save me. I remember thinking, I don't quite follow that, but wow, I better figure out what's going on because I would need to be saved. I grew up, my dad was a pastor, I didn't understand, but there was so much confusion and control, and if you want to control me, go right for the spiritual, because I will comply if anything. If you can make a Bible verse, try to tell me that, I'm following. I wanted to please God more than anything in my life. And since my husband was a pastor, it sure made sense that whatever he told me must be right. Spiritual abuse is one of the most difficult to get over, and it's one of the reasons so many people leave the church. Because if they've been spiritually abused in a relationship, the last person that they think they can trust is God. God does not abuse people. People use God to abuse people. And that's one of the things I talk a lot about is you can use almost anything to abuse someone. I can pick up a chair and throw it at you, a tool of abuse. I can use the Bible and verses in it to try to control you. So we can use animals. That's another one that you would think, obviously, we don't want you to hurt your pets. But that's not what we're talking about in this particular context. We're talking about using the animals to control a person. If you don't move back in Fluffy won't be here when you get back, right? If you leave, I'm keeping the dog, so too bad for you. Or I'm so angry at you that I'm going to hurt the pet. Or conditional affection, love, love, love the dog, not speak to, but total disdain for the human. So pets are something that's near and dear to our hearts, and it's an easy way to control someone. When we talk about the cycle of abuse, I'm going to quickly go through this because it's pretty complex to explain in a few minutes. But Peter talked a little bit earlier in pretty understandable terms. So you have the event, whatever the abuse is. This can be the physical, the name calling, the showing up at your work, whatever it is that he did that was abusive. And we talk about he, okay? I use he for the abuser and she for the victim, not because there are not female abusers and male victims, but the percentages are so high that we kind of make that assumption, okay? So please understand, I'm very well aware of that. I work with quite a few female perpetrators and male victims, but it's very skewed male perpetrator, female victim, so that's why we're using that in this context. So the abuse happens, and then there's a stage that follows, which is guilt. Now, this is not the kind of repentance, right? This isn't the, I'm so sorry. It is, I'll never do it again, except that you've heard that every time, and they just keep doing it again. So it's, I wish I hadn't done that. Please forgive me. Rationalizing, this almost immediately happens, but if you hadn't done this, I wouldn't have had to hit you. If you hadn't done this over here, you did this, that's why I had to do this. I had to control you. You made me mad. You did what? I told you not to do that. Your behavior somehow controlled them. Totally not true. But if you are choosing to rationalize an abusive behavior, you've already given yourself permission to do it again because you've already got a reason. So as soon as she does something you don't like again, you've already said, this is why you did this, so if you do that again, I have permission to go ahead and abuse you again. So the rationalization is a very dangerous stage, and we see that. Then there's the normal place. Normal, some people call it the honeymoon. This is where I'm so sorry. Let's go see your parents. Maybe we'll have a baby, send you flowers, try to make up for all the bad times. This is where you arrive at church. You've been yelling the whole way. You park in the parking lot, you open the door, and you're the happy family. Yeah, it's normal. Don't ask, don't tell. It's that if you dare bring it up, it'll happen again, so don't dare bring it up. It's not normal for a victim, but usually the abuser wants to make sure no one opens that closet. Then we have the case building, planning, and setup. Again, this gets a little complicated and technical, but it's basically all the creation of getting ready for the next time. That frustration buildup, that rationalization. And let's say he's on his way home from work. He's already having a bad day, and he remembers that he'd asked her to pay the bills. And if I get home and those bills aren't paid, I'm just not dealing with this anymore. I'm so mad. So he'll get home, and guess what? She paid the bills. So does that mean he's like, awesome, I'm so happy? No, he's still going to do it because he's already got himself totally in that mode, and he's already justified. So if there's a dirty cup in the sink, or she hasn't fixed her hair, whatever it is, he's already done a planning and a setup, so there will be another abusive incident. The church's response to domestic violence and abuse, as Pastor Aaron shared this morning, very powerful steps that your church has taken. And I think Sherry and I talked about this before, but the spiritual warfare that happens around the issue of domestic violence is no joke. I grew up in the church, totally understand spiritual warfare. Never have I seen anything like what happens in this field with all of us who are trying to work, and it comes from the places you would never expect. The number one place that someone will go to when they're looking for help with the issue of domestic violence is the clergy. Know that the clergy has the power to make the issue better or worse. God's heart, Isaiah 1:17, learn to do right, seek justice, relieve the oppressed, and correct the oppressor. Love that one. And Malachi 2:16, I was so grateful that Peter took that divorce question. I know you guys won't ask me anything about that one now. Number one controversial question, right? But Malachi 2:16, for the Lord, the God of Israel, says, I hate divorce and marital separation, and him who covers his garment with violence. Oh, we don't read that part. Anybody ever heard that part? Therefore, keep a watch upon your spirit, that it may be controlled by my spirit, that you deal not treacherously and faithlessly with your marriage mate. Oh, that's a little different twist on the God hates divorce question, isn't it? And I always like to throw the grenade in the room and walk away. How many of you knew that God got a divorce? Oh, yeah. So it was great being here. See you later. Yeah, God gave Israel a certificate of divorce because of unfaithfulness and unwillingness to do what they were called to do. So anytime you ever hear a sermon preached on that, please message me. I want to be there. Things you should know when working with victims, and I made notes about this. Why doesn't she leave? Because she loves him. He is not always a monster. Abusers can be the most charming people that you know. And she does not want the relationship to end. She does not want a failure. She's typically financially dependent on him. She fears him. She's afraid of losing her children, and often they do. She doesn't have anywhere else to go. She may not have work skills. She may not have been in the workforce for quite some time. And she doesn't want to displease God or her church. And almost always, victims believe the abuse is their fault. Anytime that you hear someone talking about who's at fault, you're already going down the wrong path, right? We gotta get some clarity before we start pointing blame in an abusive relationship. Please listen carefully when you're working with a victim, because she's only giving you a little tidbit to see. If you respond really dramatically, she's not going to trust you with any more information. So listen carefully. Do not intellectualize or spiritualize the issue. She already read all the books, remember? She's heard it. Do believe her. Do not discount her feelings. Remain calm. Like I said, don't become emotional. Reinforce that she's not to blame for someone else's choice to pick up their arm and hurt her or say horrible things to her. Do not ask her what she did to make him act that way. It's that typical, you got raped, well, what were you wearing? It's that same kind of thing. Well, have you been submissive? I remember when my husband left me after 10 years of marriage and that many same years in pastoring churches, and he walked away and said, we were never really married. Those two kids, I don't know where they came from, but he said, I never fully submitted. What? So I didn't do anything to make him act that way. That was his own level of crazy. And at that time, I didn't even think I was abused. I was so confused to what was going on, and typically that's what a victim is dealing with. Help her see what her options are. Don't tell her what to do. Support her decisions, but do not be judgmental. Understand that the abuse is not her fault. Don't say she's being codependent or enabling. I hear a lot of people say, well, maybe you should go to a codependent class, whatever. One of the things that I wanted to make sure when we talk about getting help, couples counseling is never appropriate in abusive relationships. I can't stress that enough, and yet I see churches doing it all the time. Couples counseling is never appropriate. Why would it be safe for her to say what's really going on in front of him? Do you think she's not going to pay for that all the way home and for the rest of the week? She can't say what's really happening. So it's not okay. She wants to get help, but do not encourage couples counseling. Help her to develop a safety plan. If you need one, there's one on the ARMS website. You can download it. If you really are uncomfortable, find somebody who is comfortable. Don't help somebody if you feel like you're way out of your comfort zone, because it really is difficult. Like the pastor said this morning, you may feel like you're helping, but it might not be helping, right? So just really remember that confidentiality and safety is very critical. You could be dealing with someone very dangerous. Do not act like it's no big deal. confidentiality, and don't go to him and get the rest of the story. The church is really great about thinking that we always go and find out the rest of the story, as if he's not going to be able to charm you into believing whatever he wants you to believe. He will. He's probably already come to you and told you she's crazy, she's off her meds, and you need to help him. So watch out for that. Help her find resources. Don't do all the work for her. She needs to be empowered to help herself, so we want to always walk with them, not do it for them. Let her know that you're there for her and don't give up on her. Abusers are charming and easy to believe. They may have a history of abuse in their childhood. They think they're the victims. I work with abusers. It's my favorite thing. Right? I'm crazy, I know. No, it's so empowering and exciting because God can transform people. And when you see God change an abuser, that's like the biggest miracle God's doing on this planet right now, I'm telling you. It's so exciting to watch them get a hold of who they really are in Christ and start walking it and behaving that way. Every victim wants to see the abuser healed. Every victim wants their abuser to change. And providing that in the church is the best place to do that, if at all possible. They think she's the problem, an abuser does, and they have an explosive temper. Let me tell you some stories. Okay, and remember I talked about minimizing, justifying, and denying, very classic. And they're jealous, very jealous. She might leave me if anybody finds out, that kind of behavior. And they control, big issues of control. All right, how to help them. We have to protect the real victim. We have to hold him accountable. Do not allow him to focus the blame on the partner. Support her boundaries. Boundaries is a really key thing. I'm really pleased that you guys have a group about that. Make sure that you understand boundaries. And encourage him to attend a program and individual counseling. And we need male mentors. Male mentors is one of the hardest things trying to find for a perpetrator. Because guess what all the guys at church tell him? I don't even know why you're in that program. You're a really nice guy. Thanks. Yeah, that's not helpful. I need men who understand the issue of abuse and are going to help me bring the accountability and change in that abuser's life by calling him on his stuff. And frankly, the church doesn't do a very good job with that, right? But repentance is turning and walking the other way. That means I have to do something different every day, and I have to have somebody help me and teach me how to do that. So in order to bring change, we have to have someone who's going to help a man walk that path. The belief systems take time to change. Here at the end, quick stats. 40% of female students report knowing someone who's been hit or beaten by their boyfriend. Dating abuse is one of the highest rising issues that we're seeing in our culture, and it's all about power and control. Frequent exposure to violence in the home not only predisposes children to numerous social and physical problems, but it teaches them that violence is a normal way of life. I appreciated Peter talking about normal doesn't mean healthy. Yeah, most people think that abuse is just normal. If you ever watch TV, there's so many abusive behaviors on TV, it's beyond. So if kids think that's how it always is, they're going to be exposed to that. Child abuse occurs in 30 to 60% of family violence cases that involve families with children. It is domestic violence in a home is the #1 predictor of child abuse. So CPS knows that, and they are going to investigate you for domestic violence if they think there's child abuse. There's probably domestic violence, and that they're going to talk about the most help for the kids is getting the parents healthy. 5.3 million women are abused each year. $8.3 billion it's costing society for domestic violence, and that is not including the criminal justice system. We're talking about the cost of rape, physical assault, stalking, and death from domestic violence. So if you don't think this is an issue, check your pocketbook. $8.3 billion. Not only that, but the Center for Disease Control is talking about abuse, especially childhood trauma, as the #1 health problem that we see in our country. #1. That's a pretty big wake-up call. As a Christian, this is what gets me every time. I don't care if you're a victim, a perpetrator, or those who work with this field. You can hardly talk about this without feeling the heartbreak of God. We sing that song, break my heart for what breaks yours. What exactly is that? Broken people who don't love one another but are hurting one another. That's got to be pretty heartbreaking to God. So it's a field that you may have noticed I'm pretty passionate about. And so is Peter, so is Sherry, and so is your pastor. It's something that there's no way if I work my entire life trying to help people that I can get to the bottom of this. But every single individual that I can pray with, that I can see turn to God for healing of their emotional trauma, the physical abuse that they've suffered, every man that changes and becomes accountable and becomes more like Christ, there's nothing more rewarding. I tease pastors all the time that I have the best job ever because I see people in crisis who want to change today. They're like, pray for me. I need help. I'm like, man, if the people in the pews on Sunday morning did that to the pastor, he'd be so pumped up he wouldn't know what to do. Instead, he's up here yelling, trying to get somebody to say amen. You can't even get anybody to get involved. It's so hard, right? They're calling me, crying. They're at a desperate moment. You want to get in the battle? This is where it's at. It's messy. You might want to get your stuff together before you dig in because it's messy. It will mess you up. You're going to take it home with you. You're going to not be able to sleep. You're going to cry. You're going to sit at conferences where we talk about really fun things like domestic violence. But man, is God real? This is powerful stuff. It changes you. It changes everything. This isn't just fun fly-by-night stuff. This is getting real. We're changing lives. And there's some people here in this room, I'm guessing a little higher than the national average, who are ready to have that moment, who are ready to bring change to your life. Whether you've been a victim as a child or as an adult in a relationship. And frankly, I'm imagining there's a couple of perpetrators here in the room. Oh, you probably don't call yourself that, and you're not going to raise your hand if I call on you, right? But I'm going to be here, and I'm so excited about helping people find that change and that healing that God has for them. So I'm wearing a purple lanyard. You can come talk to me. I'll be here the rest of the day. And we'll do some Q&A now, if you're brave enough to throw that question up. Do we have any questions? Is this the same one? This is the same one you've had all this time? Any new ones? The one that's up here is the one you ended with, but oh, here we go. All right, someone might refuse to talk to an abuser to protect themselves. How do you respond to an abuser who says, you're trying to control me using the silent treatment, etc.? When we try to protect ourselves, abusers can accuse us of being abusive in our means of defense. All right, so one of the things we know about abusers is confronting them doesn't work. Most of us realize that. You're not going to, if they really understood the issue and were educated, they would stop doing this. That's not how it works. So I don't recommend confronting an abuser unless you really know what you're doing. Victims should never confront abusers typically because that puts them in more danger. They've already probably tried that many times. Can we please talk about this? You're not listening, can we get help? So there are ways of coping with abuse that typically would include silent treatment. And that if you're a victim in a relationship, that may be something that you've done to protect yourself. And if you're going to stay in that relationship, that might be what you have to do. But getting out of that relationship, the abuse has to stop one way or the other. And so him becoming accountable, not to a victim, but to someone else outside of that relationship until the change becomes permanent. Abusers can accuse us of being, abusers will always accuse victims of, I get that in my groups all the time. Abusers learn finally, we're not supposed to do this and we're not supposed to, but she does all that stuff. She's always abusive. She's horribly abusive. She should be in this group. They say that every week. She should be in this group. And I'm like, she may be. She can call me. I got another one on Thursdays, But that's really not the issue. That's called blaming. That's called, I don't want to deal with my stuff. I'm going to blame it on somebody else. So I think you're probably needing to protect yourself. If you're worried about protecting yourself, then you probably should not confront. Does that kind of answer that big, long one? Is it still considered the planning and setup phase if he doesn't plan? Okay, men say they never plan. They never plan. And I teach this a lot, and actually they do plan. Remember that rationalization part? If you have in your mind a reason why you do what you do, and she did that, well then you've already decided the next time she does something you don't like, you can go ahead and do your abusive behaviors. So that's the planning. Now, they say a lot of times, well, I didn't mean to, it just happened that I picked up my arm and no. You have to have thoughts that control muscles. So a lot of times, decisions and rage and blackouts and all that, you don't go from having a nice conversation to that. There was all these choices that you made all the way down the line that got you to this point. So I don't have a lot of time to go through this whole thing, but outbursts are not random unless you have a mental health problem, which could be. Should get that checked out. But typically that's not the issue. There are choices that are made all along the way. So there usually is planning and setup. Might happen very quickly in your head, but it's still there. All right, next question. Do you ever, okay, yeah. I do. I see abusers change all the time, and that's a really exciting thing. Now, they have to make a choice to change. No one can make an abuser change. In Washington State and in the state of Idaho, men that are mandated to go to treatment, it's a year-long program. It's not a weekend retreat where you learn how to stop being abusive, because it takes a long time to change belief systems. And power and control beliefs are pretty deeply ingrained. So yes, as I said before, God can transform a life. If I don't believe that, if I don't think he has resurrection power, I couldn't do this. Because there's a lot of really stubborn people out there. But God can do that if the heart's willing. Absolutely. And is it a problem with men? No, we talked about this. Women do use abusive behaviors, and there are some women who are actually abusers. Typically, they're what we call secondary aggressors, which means they were a victim at some point in their life previous, and now, instead of being a victim, they've decided they're not going to do that anymore. They're going to become the powerful one. So oftentimes we see that. And a lot of times there are mental problems that we see. I would say those are more my CPS cases where there's abusive behaviors, but typically she's not in control of anything. It's kind of almost like out of control relationships. But yeah, women can use abusive behaviors quite well. I've known a few women who are using abusive behaviors. Whether they have power and control, that's a little bit different. Sometimes has to be diagnosed. How do we know when the abuser has actually repented? One thing is, if someone loves you, they will respect your boundaries. So that's a really good way to tell if someone's changed, if they respect you and the decisions that you've made, the boundaries that you've put in place. Ready for a new relationship with you or anyone else? That's a really good question. I think it takes a lot of time, and I think it's really important that it's been tested and tried. Selfishness is the root of all sin, right? So if it's all about you and what you're looking for and what you want and controlling all of that, you're just headed back into another abusive relationship that you're going to try to control and get what you want. So if someone's heart has changed, they're going to be looking for something different in a new relationship. So that'd be a pretty good indication. That's kind of a long, hard question, but the next one here, I think I've got time for one more. How do you prevent your child's father? Can your voice SubCycle? Well, so if, for example, if you're not with the children's father anymore, but he's still abusive or was, it's very hard to be in a relationship with an abuser after you're not in a relationship with him, right? So, but he's the kid's dad. So I work with so many moms who are dealing with this. And I think you have to have boundaries. You have to stick to your boundaries. You have to limit contact. He knows exactly what he can do to get to you, so you have to really have very strict, and I usually try to get court-ordered parenting plans, mediation, make sure that's really tight, because it's very easy for him to get back in your life, and you can feel like you're on the crazy train again. Guidelines and tips for letting a person back. When it comes to your children, I wish it was easier, but there's a lot of laws that protect parenting. So he is probably going to be allowed parenting time, and you have to do the best that you can to help your children. One thing I always say to parents is that child is half of that other person. If you talk bad about that other parent, no matter what a piece of work he is, that child, the only way they know how to interpret that is, I'm just like that because I'm half of that as well. And so you're talking that to your child, and you have to be so careful not to put your child in that situation. Your child is not going to grow up to be just like him. So don't assume that. Yes, children are more likely to become victims or perpetrators if they're raised in homes where there are abusive relationships, and so it's really important to teach them what the red flags are, to example, model, and have mentor healthy relationships around the kids so that they can actually see what good, healthy relationships look like. How many more are there? If your pastor, they just keep coming. If your pastor or church is not responding well to abusive situations, how do you help them understand? Mass mail them every book about abuse. It will help. No, it won't. This is the last question. Good, thank you. It is very difficult to get pastors. I do pastors trainings all over the region. They don't come. Can't get pastors to show up. It's very hard. So invite them, explain something to them. If they are at all open, it might take 2 or 3 times, but it is critical, and there are things out there. There's a lot more sources out there for the church and abuse than there ever have been, so I really recommend continuing to keep that door open as best that you can. And it's, again, peer-to-peer. If you say, hey, Pastor Aaron, Pastor so-and-so down the road doesn't seem to be hearing me. Would you mind talking to, I'd really like to be able to explain to him what's been going on and what's going on maybe in his church or whatever. Because they're more likely to hear from another peer. So that can really help. Last one? One more? All right, thank you so much for all your questions and answers, and I'll be around all day, so.
Thank you so much for that. Great information. I'm sure if you guys have more questions afterwards, you can get with Ginger, and I'm sure she'd be happy to talk to you a little bit more about any questions you may have.